For this knife build, I chose to use an old file for the blade material. The size, thickness, and pattern of this file are perfect for what I have in mind. Once I sketch a rough template of what I want the blade to look like, I use an angle grinder to cut off large chunks of material before taking it to the belt grinder. For profiling, I use 60 grit ceramic belts. The only two brands of ceramic belts that I've used are from Red Label Abrasives and Combat Abrasives, and out of the two, I prefer Combat Abrasives. If you have other recommendations though, please throw them in the comment section below. After the desired profile is achieved, I use Dykem layout fluid and a caliper to mark where I want to grind to. For the initial grind, I bring the edge of the blade to the thickness of a dime. This helps ensure that there are no warps after the heat treat. I think just about every knife maker would agree that grinding the bevels and the blade is the most challenging part of building a knife. Using a bevel jig, like the one I have here, will help ensure that both sides of your blade have the same bevel degree. The thickness of the tang is 1/4 inch. The goal here is to take away just enough material so that the tang fits nicely in a 1/4 inch hole. In my opinion, the best way to heat treat files and rasps would be the same way you heat treat 1095. Bring to a reddish orange, soak for 10 minutes at that temperature, then quench in mineral oil preheated to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. After that, I temper in an oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour and a half. During the final bevel grind, I start with 60 grit ceramic belts and finish with 120 grit ceramic belts. Upon analyzing the bevels, everything seems to be symmetrical and even. This means that I can start working on the handle construction. Using the Antler as a guide, I cut 2 pieces of brass to use as the pommel and the bolster. Both pieces of brass need to be center punched as closely to the center as possible. I left some wiggle room in my cuts, so eyeballing the center will work just fine. I will be using a 1/8 inch brass pin to connect the pommel to the antler, so a 1/8 inch diameter hole will be drilled in the pommel. A 1/4 inch hole will be drilled in the bolster because that's the diameter of the tang. I use a diamond Dremel bit to remove additional material from the brass bolster. I find it much easier to make the bolster fit the knife than the knife to fit the bolster. However, usually a combination of both is required. Finally, after a lot more work, the blade seems to fit nice and snug. I decided to use black G10 liners as spacers between the antler and brass. I think this will really give the knife a clean and professional look. The same process that was used for the brass was applied to the spacers. I used a scroll saw to cut off part of the antler that wasn't needed. Eventually, I would like to add a bandsaw to my shop, but for now, this scroll saw gets the job done. Once I figured out what end of the antler I wanted the pommel to be on, I used a 1/8 inch drill bit to make a hole for the brass pin to be inserted. When applying epoxy, I always make sure I cover as much surface area as possible. Once all the fittings are in place, I clamp everything in a vise and wait 24 to 48 hours for the epoxy to cure. The epoxy I use sets in 5 minutes, so I always make sure I have cotton swabs and isopropyl alcohol on hand. This works really well at removing unwanted epoxy. My hand sanding process is simple. I start with 120 grit and work my way up to 3000 grit. This is a process that should not be rushed. Until I get a bench grinder with a wheel attachment, these Dremel buffing wheels will have to suffice. They seem to work fairly well, but it takes longer than normal to get a blade nice and shiny. I have come to realize that some metals will not get a perfect mirror finish no matter how hard you try. Old files are no exception. However, I still like to get as close to a mirror finish as I can for all steels that are not stainless. Because this tang will not have a pin, I'm using a diamond cutoff wheel to make notches in the tang. These notches will give the epoxy something to grab onto. Once the pommel has fully cured, I can begin working on fitting the bolster and tang. I start by drilling a 1/4 inch diameter hole in the center of the antler. For future projects, I will make sure to find the exact center of the antler, as I ended up being a little off on this one. The process for fitting the tang and the bolster is pretty much the same process that was used for fitting the pommel. No matter what you're using epoxy for, the main goal you should have is to make sure everything dries where you want it, and to make sure everything dries nice and tight. Now that everything is cured, I can take it over to the belt grinder and begin removing material. When hand sanding brass, I go 120 grit, 320 grit, 600 grit, then 1000 grit. This process, along with hitting it pretty heavily with the buffing wheel, always seems to give a nice mirror finish. As this was my first time working with Antler, I made a few mistakes while taking off brass material on the grinding belt. I ended up digging into the antler with the belt, and I was trying to come up with some sort of solution to get rid of those marks. And what I came up with was basically taking uniform sections off both the bolster and the pommel side of the antler, wrapping it in the same thread I was going to use to stitch the sheath, and coating that thread in epoxy so that it becomes water resistant. Sharpening a knife is probably one of my favorite steps in the knife making process. I try to record myself doing this as little as possible because I really enjoy just turning on some nice music and just kind of zoning out. When the sharpening is done, I always like to test my blades out on a piece of paper. This is a surefire way to really see how sharp your knife is. And as you can see here, this knife is very sharp. And there you have it. After some final cleaning and a little bit more buffing, we are finally done.